In this episode, I'm going to talk about ways to associate Firebase users with data in the real-time database. I'll go over 3 different methods and when to use them, and also talk about ways to keep them secure on the back end. But before we get into that, it's important to go over a couple NoSQL database design best practices. If you come from a SQL background, you're used to designing a database that is completely centered around relationships. In NoSQL, we care less about relationships and more about the efficiency of the actual query that we're making. Consider a database design that has everything nested under the user ID. If you wanted to loop over just the users and display their username, you'd also have to load all the nested data further down the tree, which would become very inefficient if you have a lot of records. A better way to handle this is to keep the data shallow, so you only query for the actual data you need. Now we can start building some user relationships with Firebase and Angular 4. The first method works by nesting a user's items under their own user ID. This is ideal when you're showing data that's organized by user, for example, a Twitter feed. Here we have an item service, and we're going to import both the Angular Fire database and the Angular Fire auth module. Then we create an item class which represents our data at this point with just one body string attribute. This class will be returned to us as an Angular Fire list observable. When we inject the service, we want to subscribe to the Angular Fire auth state, and we'll set the user ID returned from that auth state to the user ID on the service. This allows us to make queries based on the currently logged in user's ID. Now that we have the user ID, we can hit the database for the list that is nested under that user ID. If it's undefined, we just return null. If it's defined, we interpolate it into the path to the database. If we want to create a new item, it's as simple as pushing another item object onto this list observable. Back in the app, we can see that when we create a new item, it's nested under that user's user ID as expected. If we log out and log in with a different user, we shouldn't see any items in the feed, which we don't. And if we create a new item with this user, their data is nested under their user ID, essentially separating the data by user. This works great on the front end, but we also need to secure the back end data with a Firebase database rule. In this example, we match the user ID that the data is nested under with the actual auth ID in Firebase. If it's a match, then we allow the write operation to take place. A second way to associate users with items is to save the user ID as an attribute on the item itself. This approach is useful when you need the association, but you're not querying by the user, for example, comments on a blog post or something similar. We can make this work by modifying 3 lines of code. First, we add a user ID to the item class. Then we set that user ID on the item when it's created. Then we remove the user ID from the database path because we're no longer nesting under the user ID. Back in the app, we create a new item, and we can see that user ID is on the item itself. Then if we create another item with a different user, we should have a different user ID on that item, but still both items are coming up in the feed now. In Firebase, we can see the user ID attribute is on each item. To secure the backend, we see if the existing data in the database has a matching user ID. And we also allow the write to occur if it's null, because that means the user is creating a new item. The third scenario is when you have items that can be associated with multiple users. In this case, we create a collection of members that are nested under the item ID, and the key for each member is that user's user ID. Back in the service, we'll create a new function to join an item, passing it the item's key as an argument. The data will be the user ID for the key set to true. We return the current members as an object observable, then update that observable with the new data. To leave an item, we follow the same basic approach. We query for an object observable with the current user ID, and if it exists, we remove it. Back in the app, we create a new item that defaults to no members, and then we can click the join button, which will add that user ID to the list of members. When we log in with a different user, we should see that they can also add their user ID to this item. Going into Firebase, we can see that the members collection on this item gets updated with the key after each button is clicked. That's it for this episode. If you found the video helpful, please like and subscribe. And if you want to support the channel, consider becoming a pro subscriber at angularfirebase.com. For just a few bucks a month, you'll get access to exclusive content as well as free one-on-one project consulting. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.